right, good morning, everybody. Welcome. I hope that everybody's at the right level of caffeine this morning. I know I'm not. So if you're one of those two people that Andy Lecates identified yesterday in the keynote as not knowing me, here's three things about me. I like coffee. I also like Lego. And I like Formula One. So anytime I can do two of those three, I'm very, very happy, as you can see. All right. I'm actually not a director anymore. If you're on LinkedIn, you may have seen the rash of promotions at Soliant. So we have a great team, and everybody is doing extremely well at Soliant. So this is why we're here today. And there'll be two parts to this presentation. I'll walk you through some of the fundamentals and why I think everybody should care about what we're trying to pick up in this session. And then I'll go into a demo that shows exactly how I go about trying to troubleshoot an issue using all the logs that we have in FileMaker Server. So at any time during the presentation, if you have a question, just raise your hand, shout out, stuff like that. Like, we don't need to save them up until the end of the presentation. We may be covering things that you're not familiar with, so don't let anything stand in the way of you understanding and grasping what it is that we're going to do here today. If you are on the Claris community, you will have heard me say, read the logs, go check the logs every time that people report that there's an issue with their server or their solution. So clearly I care a lot about the information that is in there and why it behooves us, I guess, to get familiar with using that. And what the graph here shows is sort of like the typical arc of any solution. Right? And we can look at it on two axes. One is how happy is the client, and thus how much money are they willing to pay for us to continue to work and build the solution, versus the complexity and the load that we put on the solution. Like, how does the solution grow in our building, but also in the number of users, the amount of functionality that we put in the solution. So all of those two things. And in the keynote, we talked about that first part, like onboarding people, getting them to commit to the solution, building out the solution. There's a flip side to that, right? The flip side is the downward spiral, if you will. And this is typically what happens, right? Like, a solution grows over time. Decisions are being made about how to build it and what to do with that. And of course, we're better today than we were yesterday. So the decisions that we made yesterday were potentially not the best ones architecturally and any design decision. So when the performance of the solution starts to decline, very often what we see is the platform gets blamed. The developer too, but the platform, right? This is the typical place where they go like, yeah, FileMaker can't handle that, right? And they start looking for alternatives, whatever that may be. What we're trying to do today is basically give you the tools and empower you to extend that life cycle of the solution, right? If we're good at troubleshooting, if we can find the reasons why things are not working exactly as we had expected them to work, then we can push out that arc and give our solutions a bigger life cycle, right? So if we can find those blockers, then we can eliminate those blockers, and we can keep our customer happy for longer. So the kind of troubleshooting that we're going to talk about isn't the functional thing, right? We're not trying to find bugs. We will find bugs typically as we set out to do this, but that's not our primary goal. Our primary goal is to make sure that the solution, as deployed on the server, remains performance for as long as it can. And if it isn't, we'll try and find out where, right? So we're all about the performance and the stability. But we will find pointers to functional areas that we can improve and that we could or should redesign. So we're back to this. So our solution is logging a lot of information, right? It is telling us exactly what's going on. So how do we listen? And it really comes down to this, right? I absolutely love this quote. And William Deming is sort of like the patron saint of the quality movements. And to some extent, that's what we're doing, right? We're trying to improve the quality of our understanding and our troubleshooting with this one. And so it starts with the data, right? The data that is in the logs is the thing that speaks to us, right? And we just need to be able to parse it, to understand what exactly is in there. And because that's what we're trying to do here today, right? We're going to use the logs to find out exactly what's going on. So the capacity to collect, process, and then draw relevant conclusions from the logs, and potentially from other sources, but we will focus on the logs here, I think is vital to any developer's skill set, right? I know people tend to not care about deployments as much as they do about being in layout mode and writing scripts and all of that good stuff. But once your solution is deployed, and I've made this point many times in my career as I'm speaking, we tend to be very developer focused. So we spend a lot of time thinking on the building part. That's not where the client gets their value, right? The client gets their value once we put it on the server and they actually put it in production, right? So we want that value to last a really long time, which is typically way longer than the time that we spend building it. First, we need to be aware of a number of traps that we can fall into that will basically prevent us from drawing the right conclusions, the relevant conclusions from whatever we see in the logs. The first one is really just a play on the same thing. It comes down to we shouldn't be making assumptions, any assumptions, about before we start looking at the data, right? And it's a big trap because if we start by jumping to conclusions or taking shortcuts, assuming that we already know where this is going to go, we're going to miss things, right? And we're going to basically not be able to find the right things that we want. This is a screenshot from one of the community forums. Actually, it's an email forum, this one. And you can tell it from the highlighted part that this developer is already focused on a single thing. He's trying to find out how to make a decision on buying hardware based on a presumption that is faulty, right? I'm not saying that the memory bandwidth is irrelevant in FileMaker solution. It is, but it's only one of the many factors. It's not even the most critical factor, right? So that's the kind of assumption that will kill your ability to interpret the logs and find the reason why things are not working exactly like it is, right? So, like I said, it's not the critical thing. It's important, clearly. All the aspects of a server are important, but it's not the critical thing. It's one part of many, which is a nice segue into the next trap, and that is the myth of the single silver bullet, right? We all want things to be simple. We all want to find that one thing that will solve everything, right? If only I flip this switch, everything will be fine, right? If I change this setting on my FileMaker server, everything will be fine. Doesn't exist. So it is something to watch out for. If you're on the forums, you'll see me jump in a lot of these conversations. I don't understand where it comes from. In the FileMaker world, when it comes to FileMaker servers, people automatically tend to go to memory or the database cache, right? Like I'll up the database cache and everything will be fine, or I'll put more RAM in my machine and everything will be fine. It really isn't. I told you I liked Formula One. We're in good company when it comes to that desire to want a single, simple solution, right? So Braun GP, very surprisingly, won the driver and constructor championship back in 2009, I believe. And everybody attributes that to the fact that they had a double diffuser at the back of their car. If you don't know what a double diffuser is, it's irrelevant to the story. But it isn't, right? Because two other teams had double diffusers in their cars too. Toyota and Williams had them too. So they didn't win the championship. The documentary here it hints at it, right? So even the top-notch engineers are looking for, there's got to be a simple solution, a single simple solution for why this is. They won the championship partly because they had a double diffuser at the back of the car, but they had a slew of other things that set them apart from the other teams and made them champion, right? So it wasn't a single thing. Here's another trap. The data that we're looking at, the data that's been collected in the logs has to be relevant. And we'll cover some of that a little later in the session when we talk about how often FileMaker Server collects data and how long it keeps that data in the logs, right? The worst thing you can do is look at the logs, draw a bunch of conclusions from it, but you only have 2 weeks worth of data. And the business is cyclical. They have their heaviest load at the end of the quarter, or the end of the year, or the end of the week, right? So you may be looking at data that doesn't capture the part of whatever the time frame is that is the most relevant to the business. So that is something to solve for. 6 years ago at DEF CON, Mislav Kos, who's here, and I did a presentation on using Zabbix as a monitoring platform, because that's really where you would probably need to go to collect data over a long period of time, over and beyond what FileMaker Server gives us, is to use a monitoring platform so that you can store that data off of your FileMaker Server so that you can do long trend analysis and all of these things. This is actually the most watched video from that DEF CON, very surprisingly. So, well, not surprisingly, I was in it. Miss Love was in it. Like, what am I saying? But it shows that there's a real need for this kind of data collection, right? So keep that in mind. I'm not going to talk about monitoring platforms further in this session, but this is probably something that you need to do. It doesn't need to be Zabbix. It could be Datadog. Could be New Relic. Most bigger companies already have some sort of monitoring platform. Everything you can do with FileMaker can fit into that quite nicely. Oh, this is the other one. That myth comes from this, right? Like, for the longest time, FileMaker Server tried to scare us into not log data, right? I finally got them convinced to do away with that. It's even better than that. When you install FileMaker Server these days, it actually has all the logging turned on. There's one more log that I need to convince them to turn on, but most of the logging is on by default. So that was never true, but we don't see that anymore. A quick tip: if you've been updating your older FileMaker Server by doing an upgrade in place, the logging may still be off, right? If you install a new server from scratch, the logging is on by default. But if you have been upgrading, it may still be off. So leave now, go check, right? So those were the pitfalls that we have to try and avoid. Before we begin, the first step that we want to take is we want to make sure that we have a solid analysis of our solution, right? Because some of the things that we'll find will point to schema elements in our solution. It may say, like, you have some very expensive operation on table 142. Right? Because a lot of these logs use the internal IDs of the schema elements and not the names, right? So if you run a DDR, database design report, or save as XML, find a good tool like FM Perception, Base Elements, Inspector Pro. Get familiar with that and use it, right? Because you'll find some good information that will come out of the logs that you'll need these tools for. So FileMaker Server keeps all of its logs in a folder inside the FileMaker Server structure, right? It's, not surprisingly, a folder named logs. But you may find at times that there's files in there called with a .dmp extension. These are crash dump files. So there may be occasions or situations where FileMaker Server runs into some internal exception and will spit out one of these files. Don't ignore them. Right? If you see files like that, open a support ticket with Claris, send them the files. There's ways that you could inspect these files yourself if you're so inclined. There's tools you can download from Microsoft and whatnot, but they're a little cryptic, right? So it's much better just open a support ticket with Claris and have them look at it. They can usually point at certain processes that FileMaker Server was chewing on at the time that it ran into an exception and spit out these process dump files. So if you see them, it means that something is wrong with your server and you'd better have a look at it. Now, these things do not always happen at the moment of a crash, meaning like a FileMaker Server crash and all of a sudden nobody can connect anymore. Sometimes the collection or the creation of these dump files precedes an actual outage. And it may be your server is starting to become a little bit slower after this, right? So sometimes these happen minutes or hours before you'll have a real outage. A little tie-in to using a good monitoring platform. If you use a monitoring platform, you need to be looking for the event of a dump file being created in this folder. Actually, FileMaker Server has an event in the event log that will tell you. So if you monitor that, not always, but very often you'll get an early heads up that you need to do something. Kick your users off, reboot your server, do something like that, right? Instead of waiting for the server to go down catastrophically. Right, on to the logs. These are all the logs that FileMaker Server keeps, and they break down roughly in two buckets, right? There's logs that tell us what is happening. That's the events. And then there's logs that tell us how FileMaker Server is behaving, or your solution is behaving on that FileMaker Server, right? So that's the metrics. And then there's two logs that combine the two, that will basically tell you the events that are happening and the metrics that go with that. The top call stats log is one of my favorites. We'll spend some time on that one. The remote calls, I'll get into that later. So these are the logs. The client stats logs and the remote calls logs, those are the two that don't happen by default. All the other ones happen by default, right? So client stats log, there's nothing in the admin console for that, so you have to use the command line or the API to enable it. Just enable it, right? So when you get home, do that. Remote calls is a different thing, and I'll get into that in a little bit. So the logs, this is typically how you go through the logs as you set out to troubleshoot, right? You start with the stats log. The stats log, I'll show you examples when we get to that, but the stats log is something that happens by default every 30 seconds. FileMaker Server does a polling across many of its resources and gives you numbers, right? Now we'll go into the numbers later. It doesn't tell you what's happening. It doesn't give you any detail about who's doing what. It's just a polling of the metrics, right? If you see something that is off, and I'll give you examples of what off looks like, you can dive into the top call stats log, because that one tells you the same metrics, but it collects the 25 most expensive operations that happened in those 30 seconds. So it's a little scattershot, so it doesn't give you a full rundown of everything that happened, just the most expensive things in those 30 seconds. But it will tell you what kind of operation was happening, which gets you one step closer to finding out exactly what was going on, right? So it's got a little more detail than the stats log, same metrics. Client stats logs uses a lot of the same metrics and tells you who the user was that was doing that thing. It doesn't tell you what operation it was. So it's missing some information from the top call stats log, but it is more granular in that it tells you, it points you right to the user that was generating those numbers. And then the most details log here is the remote calls log. That one, it's the most obscure log, so I may as well get into that one. It is the most detailed log because it logs every single exchange between FileMaker clients, Go, Pro, WebDirect, doesn't matter, and FileMaker Server. So it logs everything. It tells you the operation, it tells you the thread, it tells you how big the payload was, and it tells you how long it took to do that exchange. As you know, FileMaker clients, Go, Pro, WebDirect, and FileMaker Server communicate pretty much constantly, right? So it's the most detailed, it's the most weird one as well. It's also the most difficult one to understand, but it is one that is really cool. Like I said, it's not on by default. It actually, you need to create a file called clarisconfig.json with that feature flag in it, right? So clarisconfig.json is, you'll find some blog posts on the Soliant website that go into a lot of detail on feature flags. This is one of the feature flags. So this is how you enable it. This is not one that you want to enable and keep running because it collects a lot of stuff, right? You can enable it on the client, and then it will collect everything that happens between that client and the server. You can also enable it on the server, and then it'll capture everything from all clients. I wouldn't recommend that, right? Like typically you're trying to troubleshoot something and you want to have control over what you're measuring. So you wouldn't typically do that on the server. You can if you want to, right? So here's a use case of where we use that remote calls log to a great effect. A client was having a lot of performance issues, and they came to us specifically with these two demands, right? We got 3 layouts that load horribly slow, and so what do? The first thing we did is we mapped out where their server was in relation to where the clients were, right? So the thing in red there is the server, and the red thingies are where all the clients were. And we all know the further away you are from the server, the poorer the performance. There's this thing called latency, right? Like things take time to travel on the network. And in this case, if you can see the numbers there, 85 milliseconds. It may not seem much, 85 milliseconds, but you'll understand in a few slides down why that's relevant. Latency isn't the problem here, right? Latency is a fact of life. You can change that. Well, I guess you can find some ways to get the users closer to the server, maybe do some remote desktop things like that. But latency is always going to be there. So that's not the thing that we want to change here. The most important strategy, though, is understanding the effects that the latency has on your solution. Right? So this is one of those layouts. What we did with this is we basically, on one of our test servers, we enabled that remote calls log. And we basically, we've done a divide by half, right? So we took this layout and basically navigated to that layout and used the remote calls log to see, okay, what kind of calls between the client and the server does that generate? And then we removed things individually to see what the effect was of that, right? So the numbers in red are the number of calls between the client and the server just to draw that layout, all right? Every single call will be affected by the latency, right? Because every call that the client makes needs to travel to the server has to respond back, right? So every call is a two-way communication. Every call that you make is impacted by the latency that you have, right? The great thing about this is if you do something like that, you can figure out very quickly what is it that we need to focus on, because that's what troubleshooting is all about, right? Like at the beginning, you don't know anything. You don't know where to look. When you go through this, you want to go straight to the thing that is going to be the most impactful when you change it and when you fix it, right? Interesting thing, the top right corner there, outside layouts, we've always had that question, like if I move things outside of the visible layout, does it have an effect? Like, yes, it does, right? Like depending on what you put there, it will still generate calls between the client and the server, right? So clean that up, because it is impacting your solution. So clearly, from all of this, it's this area here that we need to focus on, right? So that bottom area generated 110 calls.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
What about an object that has been hidden? And it's in the, whatever it is. So you have something that is not visible, that would be affecting performance. What about something that is hidden? Not conditionally, just hidden like, always hidden. I mean, like a one condition.
Yeah. If you use so the question is, what about hidden objects, right? Like, do they still generate calls? The short answer is no. The long answer is the behavior has been different between different versions of the FileMaker platform. So the only way to know is to measure it. Right now, if you use the height calculation, the height condition, FileMaker doesn't even begin to draw it, right? So it doesn't generate any calls. Good question. Yep. Yep, good question, Ms. Love. So the question is, do we have to worry about caching as we measure these things? And the answer is absolutely, right? FileMaker gives us the tools to blow out the local cache, right? So that's the best way to start that, so that you close FileMaker, blow out the cache, make sure that you measure the exact same scenario every single time, right? So it's a really good question, because it's easy to overlook that and then to draw the wrong conclusions, right? Because the data is different and go like, oh, I did something and you didn't do something. But yes, absolutely, right? So this whole layout, actually, to give you some numbers, generated 140 remote calls between client and server, and the total payload was about 800 kilobytes just to draw this layout, right? So clearly we just needed to focus on this. If we can solve for whatever is going on here, we can cut down significantly on the number of calls that this layout generated, right? So this was one of the other layouts, slightly more complex, and again, there's a couple of things outside of the layout there that we needed to look at. Here the picture wasn't that clear cut, but there's two areas right here and right there, 12 calls each, right? So those were the ones that we focused on first to figure out what was going on there. And part of the solution for this was to, I'll get to you in a sec, part of the solution here was to go away from portals and use web viewers, data tables, JavaScript-based things, right? So you'd have to experiment with what works best for your solution and what the user experience is and that kind of thing. But it's a great way to look at that stuff. And I'll get to your question, right? I won't go deeper into that, but there's a great presentation from Carl, and Carl is here, so you can accost him after the session here. He did a really good presentation a couple of years ago when we had AutoEnter Live during COVID. Actually, it's a two-part presentation that goes into that very, very deeply. Yep, question?
Yeah, I saw there's a lot of confidence with zero calls. I assume it's because it's from the same table as the layout.
The question is that there were a number of parts on there that had zero calls, and so the assumption could be, is it from the same table? It's been too long. I don't know the exact details. So it could be that the portal maybe was empty and there wasn't any real data in there, something like that. But yeah. Your question points to something that we, I guess, intuitively understand about solutions, that all the layouts are based on a table occurrence, and the table occurrence sits in the middle of a graph somewhere. If you need to grab data that is a couple of relationships away, of TOs away, that just takes longer than otherwise. FileMaker needs to do the queries to make all of that happen. We have no control over these queries, right? So FileMaker does what it does. But the tool will tell you exactly what that is, right? So, and then you can start to experiment. What if I denormalize my data, right? Instead of going and grabbing it related, what if I do put it in the table? So it opens it up for a lot of experimentation, and you can measure the impact of your experimentation. Like, we don't have to guess, right? That's the beauty of doing this. No more questions on that?
Well,
yeah, go ahead.
How would you do that? Would you like create duplicate layouts, or just try once and change it, try again?
Yeah, no, the question is, how do you experiment, right? So do we create new layers? The short answer is yes, right? So obviously this is all on the development copy of the solution, and then you just create a duplicate layout and start experimenting with that. Go ahead.
I watched a thing about like number of round trips. I think it was Chris Irvine gave a presentation at a previous DevCon using like Wireshark to watch like activity, and I don't remember. I'm kind of reaching here. Was there some technique that you could like delete the local cache file and then just like lock it so that it can't be recreated by FileMaker, so you don't have to like purge the log and then close FileMaker and open it again? If you're trying to test the first time you enter a layout, for example, it's really slow.
So the question is about, I guess, preventing the cache from being written to after the first time. I'd have to think about that. We know that FileMaker has the feature to blow out the local cache, right? That's right there in file settings or FileMaker Pro settings, something like that. But locking the local cache, I'd have to look at that. I'm not aware of anything in that realm. Go ahead.
On the screen you're showing earlier, those are the total number of calls, number of calls. Is it not like, what are we using for metrics there? Is it not like number of calls times payload times latency? Like, does the payload matter more than number of calls, or is it going to correlate? Like the total number of calls is shown measurable amount more than something that's less?
Really good question. So the question is, the metric that I'm showing there in red is just the number of calls, right? Those are not the only thing that matters. The size of the payload clearly matters too. I was using just the number of calls because I was tying it to latency and the number of round trips that you have to make, and every round trip having the effect of the latency. But clearly, the more data that is stuffed into a single transmission, the slower it'll be, right? It just takes longer. Also, FileMaker has a limit to the amount of data that it can transport in any transmission. So that goes into, well, I guess, big records, wide tables, right? Like if you have a really wide table, and we know FileMaker always works with the complete record, even if you just use a few fields. If you have a really wide record with a lot of data in there, it may make FileMaker, the FileMaker client, make multiple calls, or it may take multiple calls between a client and server to get that one record to you, right? So payload does matter, absolutely.
So I want to say, someone in your community made available a file using a combination of MBS and TroyFile to delete the cache files and lock them. If you get with me after, I'll show you.
Go, okay. Yeah, good stuff. So this guy has a tool. Yep.
It's a comment really to remember that when you're troubleshooting this way, there are business questions too. Do all 47 people who are using this solution need to see 78 fields on that layout, or is some of this specialized? Can it be moved somewhere else so that we're not spending hours and hours and hours trying to resolve something technically when it's actually an operational or business issue?
Great comment. The comment is about users, right? Like exactly. Do all the users need to? All the users, if a lot of users go to this screen, do they really need to see all the stuff that's on there? Can you take some of the stuff away? I'm not going to tackle that in this session, but absolutely, right? Because that's one of the questions to ask when you find something that is non-performant. Like the people at Soliant have heard me say that many times. Like when you open a solution and you go to a list view with 10,000 records, my question is why, right? Like nobody can wrap their brain around 10,000 records. Not even the 50 records that you show on the screen. Like it makes no sense. So why are you doing it? Because you're making your client and FileMaker Server work for totally useless things, right? So yeah, good comment. Thanks. All right. I mentioned that there's a number of logs that track metrics, right? So it's kind of important to understand the metrics of what. Like what is it that it's measuring? Every application, every server has 4 potential bottlenecks. Doesn't matter if it's FileMaker or something else, right? It's going to be processing power, which is a combination of the raw clock speed, how fast is the processor, and the number of cores that is available in that machine. And the second one that is very, very important is the disk I/O subsystem. Like how fast can data be written to the disk and gotten from the disk, right? And then we have memory and we have network or connectivity, if you will, right? So 4 potential bottlenecks. And FileMaker Server, the top call stats log, client stats log, remote calls log, well, not quite, but gives us information about those 4 bottlenecks, right? So those are the ones to measure. There's a reason I showed the first 2 first, because typically those are the ones that are going to affect your FileMaker solution the most, right? When I said earlier that for some reason, when we're on the community and people think about troubleshooting, they're like, oh, when I ask about specifications on the server, the answer that I get, it's a Windows 2022 server with 32 gigs of RAM. I'm going like, don't care, right? The RAM is not an issue. As long as you have more than 8 gigs of RAM, your server is fine. It kind of depends on what you do with that. Like if you have a lot of web directs, all of that stuff, right? But 32 gigs of RAM, 64 gigs of RAM, that's never where your issue is going to be. Your issue is going to be in your processing power and your disk I/O subsystem, like 99.9% of the time. Right, we touched on that a little bit already. So these are the default settings. They're not in the admin console. It's the CLI or the API if you need to change them, but you can change them, right? So FileMaker Server collects information about those metrics every 30 seconds by default. And the log, any of those logs, can grow up to 40 megabytes of size, right? And it rolls it over once, most of the logs, all of the logs. So that means that when a log reaches the 40 megabytes or whatever size that you set on yourself, it'll set that one aside and start a new log. If the new log fills up, it deletes the old one, right? Tying it back to what I said about one of the pitfalls is the relevancy of the data, right? Like, it's kind of predictable if it's every 30 seconds. The event log is kind of different, right? Events happen and you have no control over that. It'll grow to the 40 megabytes and then roll over. So that's something that you can manage to make sure that you have enough data in there. Again, I would advocate for using a monitoring platform rather than change these, because you can set the maximum log size to 2 gigs if you want, right? It's going to make your FileMaker server slower, right? Because every time it needs to add something to the log, it's got to log that file and add to it. So you're not going to make your FileMaker server faster necessarily by doing that. So while you can adjust them, be aware that you can adjust them and play with them a little bit. But if you need data over a long period of time, use a monitoring platform. So the question is a command line, because I mentioned them a few times. Is there a list where they are?
I call support. They'll give me what I need, but not a list.
The best way to get to them is actually the command line itself has a built-in help. That one has all the commands. It's a little weird to get to them because, but if you do FMS admin help, that's a good start, and then it'll show you how you can ask for more. You're right. The online help doesn't list them all. Yeah. Oh, and we have a lot of blog posts at Alliance that talk about this, right? So you can find a lot of stuff. Klaus, you had a question?
I was just saying that I have a tool where all the commits are listed.
Yeah. Yep. So Klaus has a tool that lists all the commands. So hit him up on that. Give me one then. There are other logs too, right? So we don't need to be myopic about when we're trying to troubleshoot. We are focusing in this session on only the stuff that FileMaker Server produces, but there are other logs that can give you relevant information too. So I just want to highlight them there. So they're sort of related to FileMaker, right? So if it's on Windows, there's a bunch of Windows logs, application log, system log, all of these things that you can turn to. Actually, the second one, Tomcat Catalina, is actually part of FileMaker Server. It's when you do a lot of WebDirects, you're going to have a lot of Catalina logs in there. So if you're having issues with your WebDirect, that's the place that you can look for. They're hidden somewhere in the FileMaker folder structure, but they're there. If you search on the word Catalina, they'll come up. Actually, if you do a lot of WebDirects, it does pay to be on the very last version of FileMaker Server. Well, they just fixed the bug, but that's beside the point. Claris Engineering has added a lot of logging to the Catalina logs to trace down or help them trace down issues with WebDirect. So if you use a lot of WebDirect and you're having some issues, consider going to the latest version and then feeding those to Claris support team because they are logging a bunch of stuff there that's interesting. All right. So the rest of the logs kind of depends on the operating system of your server, but there's good information in there. All right, time to get to the demo part. This is the file that I'll be using. It's a FileMaker file, because why not? And it basically just ingests all of those FileMaker Server logs. Because you can use a text editor to look at these logs. That works just fine, and we use it all the time on a FileMaker Server just for a quick peek. But sometimes you want something that will let you slice and dice the data a little better. So this one does it. And it's broken down into all the categories. The data that I feed to this tool is not just the raw logs. I actually pre-process a lot of the logs with JavaScript because some events, for instance, mention a file or a user or a schedule or something like that. So I parse all of that out so that I can, when I look at a schedule, I can see, I can make relationships just like we always do to find the more relevant data, particularly the access log. The access log will tell us when a user connects, which files they open, which files they close, when they disconnect, that kind of thing. All right. So I actually parse that into actual sessions, and I'll show you in a minute. Because sometimes it's really interesting. If you look at one of the logs, you want to see who was in my file at the same time, right? What files did I have open? How long did I have? How long did this session last? That kind of thing. Actually, it's great to use also for when you do UAT with your users, testing, right? And you get a lot of comments from a user. You can go look and say, how long has this user been in there, right? So if it's a user that only went in 2 minutes but has like a long list of complaints, just saying, right? Like you can use the information. All right. Yep. I may have to mirror my screen here. Hold on a sec.
In the meantime, is that something you recommend doing, like kicking users if they've been on the server for too long?
Oh, good question. Do I consider kicking users off of the server if they're on too long? Let's see if I can get this to work properly. No, that's fine. I'll just move it to the other screen. There's no... Actually, is this going, not going? Yeah, can we have a quick look? I'll answer the question. The answer is it depends. I wouldn't do it by default. Like, you need to understand the business needs for that, right? But clearly, we all have these clients where they log in and go home and leave the file logged in. Is that an issue? It can be because it makes your maintenance windows awkward. Like now you have to disconnect them, and you're always worried, am I interrupting something? Are they going to lose something in their session, depending on how FileMaker behaves when you cut somebody off? Purely from a server performance point of view, it makes sense to disconnect users, right? Because you're freeing up resources. We all know that one of the core features in the FileMaker platform is that instant propagation of both schema and data. So if you have somebody connected but not doing something, FileMaker Server is going to expend some resources in keeping that server up to date, right? So if you can cut it out, it's better. But it really depends on whether the users will accept that and whether you're creating an inconvenience for them. Thank you. I wanted to show you this one first. This is what that remote calls log looks like when we import that. I'm going to spend a lot of time in there, but you can sort of see exactly every transmission, every to and from between a client and a server. You can, on the right-hand side, you see how long it took, you see the size of the payload, and you see the operation that is in there. This is actually a lot of functionality that Carl has built in his tool. He has a blog post about that too that goes into a lot of detail in how to interpret that, but that's one of those, that's how that looks like, right? I'll go here. All right, so assuming that I just ingested a bunch of logs here in there, where do I start? Like, what's my process to go through this? The first place that I go to is this, right? And actually, if you wonder what that looks like in the logs, it's a little small, I get it. In the event log, every time FileMaker Server starts, it logs a lot of information about itself, right? It tells you what operating system, what server, how many cores, what the database, like a bunch of settings is what FileMaker Server reports there. And we use that a lot because very often when somebody asks us to troubleshoot, we don't necessarily already have access to that server, right? So, but we tell them, give us your logs, and we can import that. So there's a bunch of information there that we can start to interpret. It gives us the lay of the land a little bit. What kind of server are we dealing with? Like what are some of the specs? And you can see here we got 21 records in there. It doesn't mean that we have 21 servers, but every record there is a server session, right? The information between a start of a server and stopping the server, right? So we can backtrack through that and say, how long does their server stay up on the average, right? Like what's the uptime? The reason that there's no end time here is it's the last record, right? So it's from whatever the logs were taken off that server, that was the running version of FileMaker Server. If I go back one, you can see what was that like. Oh, just a day thereabout, right? So that wasn't very good. So that'll give you information already where you go like, I have some questions about this, right? Why was this only up a day? If it could be something if you go back and you see that they're rebooting every week, right? That's another question you can ask. Why are you doing that? Have you run into issues before? Or are you just doing it out of precaution? But there's a lot of room for conversation in there. In this case, we got 12 cores in that server. It's fairly up to date. Here's my database cache, a bunch of other settings that I have in there. Bad stuff, right? This is some of the stuff that I get from the event log that tells us the things that we need to consider there. And it's going to depend on what exactly you find there. But again, a quick early indication of things that I need to ask questions about or that I need to dig deeper into as I go there. Now, obviously, I'll want to know those logging settings that I mentioned, like the size of the log, the interval. These are the default ones, so they clearly didn't change them. But it tells me which logs are on and which ones are off there as well. Right? A bunch of other information that you get, like what kind of plugins are installed, all the things we get from the event log are right there. All right? If I want to know which of those records there had bad stuff in there, 18 of them, so I can basically go and figure out what's wrong with all of that stuff, get a sense of what's there, right? So that's typically where I start. I want to know as much about the server as I can because it'll help me interpret the rest of the things. If this is a 12-core server, so clearly they thought about horsepower for their server, right? This is if I see a server, and we've seen that where like IT has given us a server with one core, like yes, you will have problems, right? So you can learn a lot by just looking at that, right? So next up, I'll go look at the events. There's a bunch of stuff in there, so you'll want to whittle it down to what it is. And the first thing that I go look for is the crashes, right? Event 701 is a crash on any of the FileMaker Server process. As we know, FileMaker Server isn't a single thing, right? FileMaker Server is a collection of processes, database engine, Java, the incremental backup. So everything is a different process, scripting engines. So any of those can crash, and this is what will tell us, right? So in this case, data API engine and web publishing engine, not the database engine. So they're probably doing some web directs. We'll need to figure out what that looks like, right? So at this point, I'm just jotting down questions to ask and things to follow up on, right? So Next up are the errors and warnings. There's a bunch of informational things in there too. I don't necessarily care about those because I've extracted a lot of that stuff already. That's, for instance, FileMaker Server reporting on its own configuration, all of that. There's going to be a lot of things in the errors and warnings that you can omit. Again, kind of depends, right? So we see a bunch of 661s in there. That's an authentication failure. Somebody's trying to log in and it's not working, right? Is that a reason for concern? I don't know. It depends, right? But if I omit those, I have 61,000 of those. So that's a bit of a high number. I forgot to mention, one of the first things that I do here, again, tying it into the relevancy of the data, I'll go to the first record and the last record and see how much data I actually have, like what kind of time span am I looking at, just to get a sense. And then I'll ask the question to the business, right? Like, do you have any cyclical events that we're not capturing that we don't have in the log that may be important? But so that's what I do. So I've isolated the 661s. Do I need to look at that? Perhaps, right? It makes sense to look at them. It could be a sign of an attack, right? Maybe somebody is trying to force their way into your FileMaker solution. So you'd better look at that. So we can definitely do that. So I got rid of those. Another good one to look at, but omit fairly quickly, are the event 30s. Those are the disconnects, right? A user being disconnected. I've mentioned it before already. FileMaker Server and FileMaker clients are always in touch, even if the user isn't doing anything, right? Like there's a heartbeat that happens, and sometimes FileMaker Server is trying to send something to a client and finds that the client doesn't respond. And so FileMaker Server will log an event 30 and say that client is gone, right? So you can omit those. I got 1,500 of those. What I typically do with those is I will probably pivot those, drop them into Excel and create a pivot. The thing to watch out for here is, do these come as totally random events? It's a random spread in time frames for this, or do they come in clusters? If they come in clusters, it probably points to a problem closer to the server, a networking issue typically, closer to the server than if it's randomly spread. If it's randomly spread, especially these days with a lot of people working from home, it's probably just crappy Wi-Fi or something like that, right? Like, or people closing the lid or without closing FileMaker and walking away, that kind of thing, right? So if it's random, probably not a big reason for concern. If you detect clusters, that is something to look at, right? You need to figure out what's going on with the network closer to the server that's happening there. The other thing that you'll learn when you throw a pivot table at this is it always the same user, for instance, right? Because then you can go work with that user to maybe get them hooked up to Ethernet where they're working, that kind of thing. Or potentially it could be a cluster of users and not other users, which could point to a networking issue with the switch or the hub, router, closer to where those users are, right? So there's some stuff in there. Stephen?
What if a user has another server open at the same time? Would that affect, they're working on two different servers at the same time, would that cross back to this log?
So the question is, if a user is connected to FileMaker servers at the same time, because this log is collected at the server, it wouldn't have any information about their other connection, right? But if the issue happens at the client, like if the client is a crappy Wi-Fi, you'd expect to have two event 30s in both logs of both servers, absolutely. Yeah. All right. So we've whittled it down from 304 entries to just about 5,000, right? So we can look at some of the other ones. This one is always interesting. 690. Your schedule has exceeded its time limit. It's a warning and not an error, right? Do we understand what the difference is? What's your sense here? Did the schedule finish or did it not finish? It did. It did. When you set up a schedule in FileMaker Server, you can set a time limit. There's a secondary setting to say abort, right? If you set it to abort, then the schedule will be terminated at the timeout, and it'll be an error, another warning. The warning is just that. It just tells you you've set a time limit, it's exceeded, but it continues to run, right? again, it depends on your knowledge of the solution and what the expectation there is. But if you see this, clearly at some point somebody set a time limit for that schedule and it's being exceeded. Somebody needs to look at that, right, and figure out what's up with that. The other thing that you can see when this happens is it could be that these only show up when your FileMaker server is slow, right? Maybe the schedule normally runs just fine. But maybe your server is getting hung up on some other process, and now your schedules, the runtime for your schedules is affected, right? So that's another way to look at these things and interpret that. All right. So if I go into the stats, for instance, and that's one of the reasons why I do this in FileMaker, right? So I can jump sideways from one log to the other on the relevant time frame. So I had my cursor in here on this event on this time frame. And now I can go look at the stats log. This is the regular stats log. That's the one that just gives me metrics, but not operations. So it gives me that time frame. I'm looking at this. I'm not really seeing anything special. No high load. So to give you some context on this one, I mentioned there's the 4 potential bottlenecks on any server. So you can see here, and actually Mislav Kos, who's in the audience, created the first version of this file, for which I'm eternally grateful. So you can see in the headers that it's broken down by your typical 4 categories of bottlenecks, right? So on the left-hand side, anything that's memory related, that's basically FileMaker's cache. So the first number, 100, is how many of the client requests can FileMaker server dish out from what it has in its database cache. So the higher the better, right? So this should be 100, very close. It shouldn't dip below 95, that kind of thing. Cache unsaved is its inverse. How much is in cache that hasn't been saved to disk yet? So that number should be as close to 0 as you can. So those are the memory-related ones. The disk-related ones are raw numbers, like how much data is being pushed through the network, as measured on the FileMaker server side, right? Because again, these are FileMaker server logs. So FileMaker server can only measure what's happening at its border, so to speak, right? So, but this will give you some good information about the raw numbers. There's one more related to that, and it's right there, I/O time per call. A call is an operation, right? The remote calls log. So every time the client makes a call to the server, that's a call or an operation, right? And you've seen from that layout that I've shown, going to a layout isn't a call, right? It's all of those individual elements that are on the layout that can generate as many calls as FileMaker deems necessary to make it happen. We have no control over the number of calls that FileMaker executes, to some extent, right? We can, but it's not as simple as I'm running one script, that's one call, or there's one calculation that evaluates, that's one call. That's not what it is, but that's what's there. So disk numbers, network numbers, raw numbers. Remote calls in progress is a very important metric. That's how many of those calls that FileMaker server is actually executing at that moment in time. That number should be really, really low. If that number is a little elevated, and it's actually a little elevated here, so that would worry me, but I don't see it translated into high numbers on the processing side. It's very often an early indicator that your server is in trouble if that remote calls in progress is, say, 5 or more, right? It means that FileMaker server is chewing on something and it's taken it a bit of time. Go ahead.
Yeah, you got one call that jumps from like 10 to 100. Usually, is that just like all of a sudden it's getting hit with, the servers all of a sudden get hit with a ton of data?
Could be. Yeah, you're talking about this number here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So clearly FileMaker server has received a bunch of instructions from a user, right? So in its most simplistic form, maybe somebody just navigated to that layout that we were using, right? And now there's 140 calls that need to happen right there. So yeah, it's functional. It's not necessarily data-driven, right? Pretty much everything in FileMaker is data-driven, but it's going to be something. But it's.
Would you call that a problem? Like if it jumps that quick?
The question is, would I call that a problem? In and by itself, in isolation, it would worry me, right? But you never look at these things in isolation. Elapsed time per call is probably the second, well, this is probably the primary number that I look at, right? So this one is is an early indicator of trouble, but this one is the one that I go to first. And by the way, these are microseconds, so it takes 1 million of those to get to 1 second. So these are really, really low numbers, right? These are fractional seconds. It's the fact that these are low, even though there's a lot of remote calls in progress, that wouldn't worry me. Because FileMaker is receiving a lot of things to do, but it's getting through it very quickly, right? So you look at it in combination, so that wouldn't worry me. If I see high numbers here, typically you would see high numbers there too, right? Or at least numbers that climb. But this is the one that will tell you if your server is in trouble. Actually, I call this the processing, but the elapsed time per call is actually a sum of the processing time, and there isn't a metric specific to processing, how much time it takes FileMaker to process something. It's the sum of the wait time per call, the I/O time per call, and the processing, right? So we have numbers for wait time per call and I/O time per call. So actually, you have to take this number, subtract these, and then what's remaining is how long it took FileMaker to process something, all right? In our case, the elapsed time per call is almost as high as the wait time per call. So most of the time waiting on that is spent on an operation is in waiting. And remember, this is a 12-core machine, right? So you would assume that it has enough processing power or processing capacity to get through. So what we don't know is how fast are these cores. Like if these are really, really slow cores, then having 12 of those, well, it's better than nothing, but it's not going to get you far, right? So I don't know from the numbers. That would be part of that conversation. It could also be, and that's the more interesting thing, it could point us to an architectural flaw in the solution, right? So maybe the server has 12 cores, but maybe FileMaker isn't able to use those 12 cores, right? And the typical scenario under which that would happen is a monolithic file or a huge table. And pretty much everything think a logging table, right? So if you have audit logging that you built and the audit log table is in the same file as your actual data, then every time somebody changes some data and you need to write an audit log, it's a funnel, right? Like, because you can have operations all through your solution, but everything goes through your audit log table, and that's your funnel. That's going to be the thing, that's going to be your bottleneck, right? Because as we know, FileMaker Server still has a lock on the file every time that it needs to write to the file, and it's an exclusive lock, meaning it can only process one at a time. It's very, very fast at it, all right? But it's still one at a time. So if you have a busy system with many users changing a lot of data at the same time, and you have only one file, which is the worst possible scenario, then that file gets locked on every write. And it doesn't matter that you have 12 cores, because that's going to be where everything comes together, right? So that could be an early indicator of something like that, where you're getting hit by that, right?
If the cache hit is consistently below 100, is that when it's an indication that you might need more memory?
Yeah, so the question is if the cache hit percentage that is 100 here in our example, if that's consistently below 100, do I need to add more memory? You don't necessarily need to add more memory, but you may want to up the database cache that is a setting on FileMaker Server, right? By default, FileMaker Server comes with half a gig of database cache. And it monopolizes that. So that's data that it grabs and holds onto. It doesn't share that amount of memory with any other process, which is why you don't want to set it really, really high, because you could be starving. Typically, FileMaker Server doesn't need it, but you may be starving those FileMaker processes from usable memory that it now cannot grab, right? So the first thing you would do is incrementally increase the database cache a little bit until you see the numbers move, right? Like I said, the default is 512 megabytes. You would maybe go to 1 gigabyte, something like, just double it. Like, don't go crazy and set it to 8 gigs, right? Like, you just do it incrementally until you see the numbers get back to that 100% level. Because any database cache that you assign when your database cache is already 100 is wasted, right? And so that makes no sense whatsoever. All right, we're almost at time. Any other questions? So you can sort of see the process that I'm doing, right? So I look at one of those, and actually there's no these, right? Again, it's a little small, I apologize. But these are the typical ones that I omit from because there's things you want to look at, but they don't get you to the actual problem, typically, right? Like I said, 661s could be a problem. It could be a sign of attack. The disconnects could be a sign of some networking issues. But so you gradually omit the things until you're left with the things that really matter as you work your way through that. All right. I mentioned the sessions in here. So we had about 21,000 sessions in the logs, and that's sort of what that looks like, right? So I know what clients, what machine, what account that they used, what files they have open, how long they were open for. So all of that information is in the access log. It's just waiting for us to parse it out and use it, right? So that's really useful information.
Will this file be available to us?
It's the question is this file going to be available to us? I don't know yet. It's an internal tool, as you know. I'm sure you all have internal tools. It's not polished, right? Like it's got words. But I'll definitely consider it because it's kind of cool. All right. One last thing that I want to show you here is one of the logs is the data API log. The thing there to consider, and this is using a JavaScript library, so it stays within FileMaker. I'm a big fan of slicing and dicing data with like pivot tables and pivot charts that way. So this will allow me to do that, right? So I can then grab things, move them back out, and see how many calls the data API receives, on what endpoints in what files that way, right? So again, very, very nice visual way of getting a sense of the load that is being put on that FileMaker server through the data API. Same with the OData API, same with the XML API. So all of these things are logged and are available to us in that way. So so that's pretty much what that is. Just one more minute. So this is the top call stats log, right? So this is one of my favorite logs. This is the one that gives us some information about the same kind of metrics that we have in the stats log, but tells us the operation that was consuming that amount of time, right? This is the thing that I typically throw in Excel and pivot out, right? Because if you do that, you can scroll through that and try to figure out, like, okay, what's the pattern? Like, what is using the most time? But if you can aggregate it, you will always find the top 2 or 3 things that you can focus on, right? It could be any kind of operation. Again, no assumptions, right? I go in and just let the numbers speak to me. But this, if you aggregate it and combine the data to find the most expensive operation, it will tell you what to focus on. It will tell you that if you fix this, you will fix a lot of performance issues on your server. Like, what is the stuff that consumes the most resources on your server? So if you go fix that, it will have an impact, right? So that's a great log for doing a lot of these things. All right, we'll call it quits here. Feel free to hit me up afterwards. Chris?
We all give women answers like that.
Thank you. John?
So given that we don't all have women sitting in the desk next to us, unfortunately, what do you see as the potential of an AI type query to go, you just described the process that you go through because of experience. To what extent do you see an opportunity to go, okay, if I join this to this, and this is interpreting this, and this is grabbing this gives me a picture of a thing that I should look at. Now, I agree with you. The thing may be something I don't need to care about, but I still need to know it's a thing. Any analysis tool will just give you analysis, but you need to know whether I should care about it as well.
Yep.
To what extent do you see that as a possibility? Because it's hard work doing what you just described.
So the question is what is the potential impact of AI on doing this kind of relevant analysis, right? Like really surfacing things. I think there's great potential because this is the stats log, and how do you even begin to look at that, right? It's scrolling, right? Because when you get one of those, you don't know what you don't know. So I'm doing a bunch of this, right? Like, because I'm looking for patterns. Like what is the normal? What is the abnormal, right? But I can be doing this all day, right? That's what AI should be able to tell me, right? I should be able to throw all this data at machine learning, some sort of model that will tell me what is the normal for this deployment. Because I can't say, like, the number should always be below 10,000, because that may not be true for a particular deployment. And this number being below 10,000 could be, that's a stupid example, but could be trouble for one deployment and not trouble for another deployment. So the AI should be able to learn from the log, this is a normal pattern, and then point out where the anomalies are, right? So that I don't have to scroll through that. It should bring that to me, right? Absolutely. We haven't made it yet, so let me know when you're done. Yep, Stephen?
Have you ever ingested other third-party hardware like logs from managed network machines, network utilities, and correlated stuff?
So the question is, have I ingested non-FileMaker server logs like network logs, router logs, switches logs, that kind of thing, and correlated with FileMaker? I absolutely have. Because sometimes, I always start with the FileMaker server logs, right? Just to rule in or rule out, am I detecting problems with the stuff that FileMaker server gives me? If I'm not, but there is clear evidence that something is wrong, then I need to go look at something else, right? I need to go look at whatever the operating system tells me or the networking equipment can tell me. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yep. Quick question. With the data API and OData, services occasionally will fail, and you need to do a restart on those. Have you found anything that's been a precursor to those in the logs that would indicate that the services need to be restarted? Second part of that is there any downside of having a shell script to run the CLI command to restart those services on a regular cadence?
Yeah, so two-part question. Is there any signs of precursors to issues with some of the process, like the API or data API? And what about the impact of using the command line or the API, for that matter, to just preemptively restart them on a bit of a schedule? I'll start with the last part first. There's nothing wrong with doing some kind of maintenance restarts. It's the only effect is that as you're doing that, your service is down, right? Like, so you got to pick your moment, if you will, right? Like, what's the business impact of doing this, and am I really going to upset my users by doing that? Just like with turning on and turning off a machine, like, it can clear up gremlins that we don't necessarily understand, right? And just basically reset that whole process. As to precursors, it depends a lot on what's being used. Usually when it's a straightforward OData API call or API call that just uses the endpoints as is, we usually don't find any problems with that. Where we're finding the bulk of the problems with the APIs is when people use them to call scripts. And those scripts are not very efficient, right? So that's usually where we find issues with those APIs. And inefficient scripts, or scripts that are expensive, as I call them, they'll show up here, right? They'll show up as raw numbers, and then they'll show up in the top call stats log as an expensive operation. But yeah. But those are not usually precursors to the service failing, right? So, not always.
You mentioned some third-party logging tools like Datadog. Do you have a preference? And also, I've noticed some of the third-party logging tools have AI built into them. So.
Yeah. The question is, do I have any preference for a monitoring platform? And also the observation that many of those now have AI built in, more and more, right? Like. A lot of the good ones are not free, like Datadog, New Relic, that kind of thing. You have to subscribe. They can be expensive. Zabbix, that I mentioned, is open source and free. It tends to have fewer capabilities in the AI realm, right? Because those are what people are trying to capitalize on. So do I have a preference? Not really. It's a question that we ask of most customers when they have a FileMaker server is, do you have a monitoring platform? Then we can just plug into what you have. On our Saline Cloud fleet of servers, we use Datadog. We switched to Datadog recently. We love their capacities and building dashboards and having some of that AI at our fingertips. Cool. Somebody call Datadog and tell them that I said so.
So
Can I ask you a question? On bottom Varigon 2, where do you think about making this file available? Some of us may be willing to pay a price for it.
Yeah. So the question was asked, like, making that file available. I think I will at some point. I just need to clean it up. Yeah.
We had upgraded our network to like 100 gig backbone when servers were on, and then I upgraded the NICs to 100 gig, and it exposed us to a whole different set of problems. Like we're servers getting hit with tons of data, and we're experiencing before like Windows spikes to 100, easy to lock things up. And it's just like it's been unanticipated, created an unanticipated problem, mess for us. And I don't know if that's I/O now having issues. So, like, what's the best area to monitor?
Oh, so the question is, because you upgraded your network to be really fast, and now another slew of problems has been exposed. It's true that when you do set out to troubleshoot and you find something and you fix it, it's like playing whack-a-mole, right? Like it really is, because you say, I fixed it, and then because you fixed that, it now surfaces or shines the light on the next area of problems to solve, right? So I get it. As to what you should be monitoring, I guess all of it, right? But I would start with the FileMaker logs just to see what they tell you, right? Like, is there enough there for you to focus on what the next pocket of thing is to look at? I'd be surprised if it isn't in the disk I/O or the processing power. Like, depending on the solution and deployments, those are number one and number two on pretty much everything.
Like, you tried moving into, like, we put 4 terabytes in the C drive and SSD, and then we went back to the D drive, SSD drives, and still, I/O, is there better, like, a preference for where to store the FileMaker Server files themselves?
Yeah, so the question is, when it comes to hard disk and specifically throughput and network speeds, is there a preference where to put the FileMaker files? The live files, those are the ones that get the most writes and reads. Put those on the fastest possible disk I/O subsystem that you have, right? NVMe is great, that kind of thing. It would take some knowledge about the solution, like what's the heaviest? Is it reads or is it writes, right? You can have a solution where people are just looking at reports all day, but not generating a lot of data, so that will generate a lot of reads. If you're creating a lot of data, then it's a lot of writes. And hard drives have different speeds for either or, that kind of thing, right? So that would be the thing. I can't really give a general recommendation because I need to know what the solution does, but that's what I would look at.
When you're taking these measurements, how do you know that you don't have somebody in there doing active development?
Actually, I actually had a if I had another hour, I would show you an example. The logs will tell you. They absolutely will. I have an example of just that, right? And it'll show up in the not here. It'll show up in here, right? Because one of the operations will be commit schema, right? So if somebody doing live development and there's a lot of work being done, as we know, every time that you modify schema, be it a layout or a script, FileMaker has to replace the old schema with the new one. So there's actually a lock that happens, right? So FileMaker Server will suspend user activity so that it has the ability to take your new XML and replace the old XML, and then it releases the lock again, right? So you can have a table lock or a layout lock, any number of locks. So if you do that on a live system, they'll show up and you'll know. Yeah. And then you can wag your finger. Yep.
Hi. We just had a recent 2 times of database crash. When this crash, we use recovery, but we found out we cannot recover the whole database back. Do you think it's because the database has some corruption or something there? Because we have to roll back to last night's backup and try to use the recovery, part of the recovery, to ingest the day's event activity records into last night's backup. And that's not very good.
No, it's not very good. So the question is about recovering a file, basically a server crash that seems to have damaged the file, and the file is now not completely recoverable. So you have to go back to a backup. Yes, it's absolutely bad. The recovery process creates its own log. I have another tool to analyze that. You would have to go to that recover log to see what kind of errors it tells you, or where it stops. Because if the recovery process stops at a certain point, it's going to be at the part of the schema that has issues, right? So by going through the recover log is a nasty one to go through. It's very, very long, very verbose. So it's very tiring to try and look at it, but it's worth it, right? So figure out where it stops and work backwards from there to see what part of the schema it is in. I would open a support ticket with Claris, and send them the damaged file, and they can probably help you point out what's wrong with the file as well. The other thing with a scenario like that is you want to use the logs to see if there's any metrics that start getting elevated prior to the crash. Like, is there any buildup to the crash that you can detect? And if so, can we tell? Typically, you'd be able to tell from the topcall stats log. Do we know what kind of operations were happening? A classic example is people in a warehouse on their iPhones or iPads being connected to a live hosted file, being in a warehouse on a manufacturing floor, taking pictures, and so when you put them in a container, the client uploads them to the server. If there's a small interruption in the network connectivity as FileMaker Go uploads a container data to FileMaker Server, we've seen FileMaker Server crash because of that, right? So FileMaker, it doesn't have like a recoverable or resumable upload that we can use. So the FileMaker Server crashes in our case, but we can tell from the logs what kind of operations were happening just before, right? And then see, like, can we do something with that?
Yes, we do see the recovery log, and the 2 times always stop in one of the table, and the table is going forever. We have to stop it and then open the recovery database. They do kind of checking for inconsistency.
Yep.
And then it's able to open. But then we know that the log that was stopped on that table, all data on that table was lost. Everything else is kind of bad.
Yep.
So.
Yep. One thing that I would try in your case, I would take the damaged file, see if you can produce a clone. So drop the data and then try to recover the clone. See if it hangs on the same thing. If it doesn't hang on the same thing, it's probably somewhere in your data, not in the schema.
And also, does it mean, okay, also I suspect the server, we're using 19.6, and I saw your logs showing 20.3. Now we have a newer version like 21 or something. Which version is most safe version that we should upgrade to?
Claris is going to shoot me if I say so. I'm going to say it anyway. 20.3 is the most stable version of server that we know, but it's out of support next month. So it's a bit of a conundrum. We've been tracking some bugs in 21.0 and 21.1 that we're not very comfortable with. So if you can, stay on 20.3. That's a good version of server.
Thank you.
All right, thank you all. I'll give the room to Chris.